Hi everyone, it's Jackoff, and I'm here today with the subsequent video in my Total War Rise of Mordor unit review series. I look at the soldiers and units of different factions and break down their arms and armor, looking at their historical inspiration both in real life and within Middle-earth itself. In today's episode, instead of Dale, we'll be looking at the faction of Dol Guldur, something which I guess you could say is the equivalent faction to Dale, given that it's their main enemy army in the Hobbit series. One little note is that this faction is very clearly unfinished as of now, so this is a bit of a snapshot of its current state in the mod rather than what it will look like when it's fully developed. Now, before we look at the units, I think it's important that we talk about Dol Guldur as a faction itself. Dol Guldur is an actual location in Middle-earth, quite a specific one. It's a dark ruined castle in the southern reaches of Mirkwood, and long ago it was a great fortress of the Dark Lords. In recent times it was used by Sauron as one of his main bases all the way into the Hobbit, and you do see this in the Hobbit where it's used as a rallying point for the orc armies of the north until the White Council of Galadriel. Celeborn, I believe, is also part of it, but I'm not too sure. Gandalf, Saruman, Elrond, and I believe the Brown Wizard Radagast is also part of it, use their joint powers to force a Necromancer out of it, the Necromancer being revealed to be Sauron in one of his many guises. As a result of it being ruled by Sauron and his servants, it is quite clearly one of the evil factions in Middle-earth, and as such the bulk of its forces are made up by units that are linked to Sauron, so orcs for the most part, but also wraiths, the undead. And that makes it pretty unique compared to other factions in Middle-earth in that evil creatures are the bulk of their army, but the undead also fight for them. And a big reason for that is because of who Sauron himself is, the Necromancer, because that was one of his powers, and it's a power that not only he had, but also the Witch King of Angmar also held, which makes sense given that the Witch King of Angmar is a shadow of Sauron in terms of power. So, as a result, this unit's faction roster has undead soldiers in it, which makes them very different to all the other factions. Now, Dol Guldur is heavily seen in the Hobbit trilogy, not so much at all in the Lord of the Rings movies. I believe they're not even mentioned once in it. In The Hobbit, they're always seen, and they're the main enemy that the Free Peoples of Middle-earth fight at the Battle of Five Armies. Now, in the films, they're led by Sauron nominally, but their acting commander on the ground is revealed to be Azog the Defiler, the former orc warlord of Moria, and to be clear, in the books, it is not him at all. In the books, Azog has been dead for a very long time, but in the film series, he survives into the time of The Hobbit. As such, this is the main faction that Sauron has to work with in the time span of The Hobbit in order to fulfill his plans in the north to bring the northern lands of Middle-earth under his domination. As such, it is quite a powerful faction, and its units, when you look at them individually, you see that they share a lot of similarities with things that you see in Lord of the Rings, which makes sense because they're intentionally designed off of them. Let's get started. And our first unit is the General unit, and it's the only cavalry unit that this faction can muster. The Servants of the Eye. I'm going to be flat out honest here. This unit looks awesome. As you can see just by looking at them, they very clearly have inspiration from Sauron's armor and equipment in the Lord of the Rings series, his portrayal in them. They also seem to look very similar to the Witch King of Angmar, who, as a servant of Sauron, gets his design inspiration from him, so it makes sense that in turn lower-ranking warriors of the Dark Forces would base their inspirations off of their overlords. In terms of what role this unit plays, it's very heavy cavalry. It's not shock cavalry, which means while these guys don't have the best charge against enemy forces, when they collide with the enemy, they'll stick in combat a lot longer and be able to do a lot more damage over a prolonged period of time. Each man is armored quite well, and I mean very, very well. They've all got iron, or I'm assuming steel breastplates. Their arms are covered in steel. I don't know about... do they have for their legs? I can't really tell exactly what they have for their legs, but I think it might be leather covering their legs, and it looks like leather to me. Maybe it's got chainmail underneath, and if so, that gives them quite good protection while on horseback. I'm also fairly certain that most of the soldiers in this unit are all black Numenorians, and that is to say the followers of Numenor who chose to remain loyal to Sauron, and by extension Morgoth, instead of staying loyal to the Valar. And I think that's the reason why there's no pale underneath their armor. In terms of their other equipment, they've all got longswords, which all look very similar to the Witch King's blade. These most definitely look very realistic. They would not be out of place in the 14th and 15th centuries. They've all got capes on their back, which have the Eye of Sauron on them, which makes sense given they are his servants. Their horses are very heavily armoured, which makes sense. These are horses that are designed to go into a melee and come out of it unharmed, and as a result their faces are armoured. They have, and I don't remember the name for this, I think it's barding for horses. They have armoured barding around their throats. They've also got spikes along the back of their neck. I don't think they're really practical, if at all. I don't think these even existed in real life, but it just kind of adds to the dark menace of the horse, so I guess I'll give them a pass for it. They also have large shields on them, which look a bit like extended heater shields, or a cross between a heater shield and a kite shield, also emblazoned with the Eye of Sauron on it, and it's quite nice looking, that red against the black. The shield is kind of interesting, because given they are so heavily armoured in plate, them having shields is a bit odd, especially because in real life, when cavalry became this heavily armoured, the need for shields kind of went away, because their armour was sufficiently defensive for it to serve as their main defence instead of a shield. That said, most of the units who wore heavy armour like this generally served as lancer units, where their main weapon they'd be facing against were lancers, and in that case they didn't really need to worry about close combat as much, because their main goal was to smash right through enemy formations and then whip out their swords and start going to town, whereas these guys don't really have that benefit of being able to send their enemies flying when they smash into them before drawing their swords, so I guess it then kind of makes sense for them to have shields. Either way, it's still an excellent design as far as I'm concerned. Look at their commanding officer to see if he looks much different from the bulk of his force. And let's actually try and find him here in amongst his men. Is this meant to be him? Or is he meant to be leading them on the flank? I really can't tell. All these guys really do look alike. So someone at the back? I don't think so. My main bet would be that this guy is the commanding officer, and if so, their commanding officer does not look any different from the rest of their unit. He looks much the same as anyone else. Keeping in mind that this faction isn't finished, we'll look at their melee first. Now we get to the first unit fielded by Dol Guldur, which is special, and that is the Wraiths, the undead units that I was talking about. These creatures are raised by Sauron's dark magics, and they're good warriors, but they can also be killed in battle. They're not undead or invincible the same way that the undead army in the Lord of the Rings trilogy is. These guys can definitely kill your enemy in battle, but they can also be destroyed rather than killed. They all look quite unique, and they all have very nice ancient armor. As you can tell, it's been rusted away by many years, so it's nowhere near as effective as it should be. many of them wear a mix of outfits, some of them having armor on their arms, whereas others lack armor on their arms. They kind of look a bit like Easterling armor, and one day we will definitely take a look at the Easterlings, but that's kind of the vibe that I get from it. They look a bit like fallen Easterlings. Their swords are ancient arming swords that have been taken out of the ground to be wielded against the living. They do not have any armor for their heads, instead they're wrapped in gauze or in cloth. They do have chainmail wrapping around their torsos, which, I mean, yeah, it's armor. I don't know if it's really effective armor the way it's worn there. It seems like it's going over the breastplate instead of under it, and that really doesn't make sense to me. But I don't know, maybe the undead have a different way of wearing armor. They have shields, and they all use heater shields, which all have lost their paint, which I mean also makes sense. These are ancient pieces of equipment. They all have metal rims, and I know that's not historic, but I do not think that these shields are metal either entirely, and that is historic. Most heater shields, if not all of them, were made of wood and were then painted or covered in rawhide, leather, stuff like that to bind them together. And most definitely none of them had metal rims around their corners. These soldiers, if I remember correctly, you can't hire too many units of these, so they're very much a special unit to use. They will definitely serve as an auxiliary for your force, but they, by definition, cannot be the heart of your fighting force. So better to use them as supplementary units for your army rather than your main battle line. So now that we've looked at the Wraiths, let's see what their commanding officer looks like. Does he look any different from the rest of his undead forces? Or is he just as dead and rotting as the rest? I can't actually tell which guy is the leader. They all look very vaguely the same, so if he is leading from the front, I'd assume maybe it's this guy, and if so, he looks the same as the rest of his unit. So yeah, I guess that puts pay to whether or not the Wraith commanding officer looks any different from the rest of his units. Moving to the Guldur Blades, this unit is quite iconic, I believe, if you watch the Hobbit series, because these make up the bulk of the soldiers who fight in the Battle of the Five Armies, making up the 4th and 5th armies. Well, I think at least the 4th army, because I believe the armies that contribute to the Battle of the Five Armies change between the books and the movies. Now, if you look at them visually, they look kind of similar to the Uruk-hai, and that's actually quite a nice similarity, because these are kind of the ancestors of the Uruk-hai, at least in terms of the role they play on the battlefield as dark orc-like creatures. And while these are all orcs, unlike the Uruk-hai, they're very much heavy infantry who are made to fight in the front lines, who are large, who are strong, and who will die in high numbers and wear heavy armor. Whereas most orcs tend to wear scraps of armor, use poor weaponry, and have poor morale, so they'll break very easily in the face of determined opposition. These guys will not do that, they will fight savagely to the end. So yeah, they do have quite a nice similarity when compared to Uruk-hai. And as we go on to other factions, you'll see other heavy orc infantry that suits a similar role to Uruk-hai as well. Now, looking at these soldiers, they do wear different sets of armor, but they're all roughly similar. They're all wearing heavy plate armor over the top of chainmail, and while the armor is not pretty, or it doesn't look great, it looks as if it had somewhat served for creatures who don't really care about such stuff. And yeah, it seems just highly mass-produced and just stuck together. Good enough to do the job, but not really good enough to exceed. Now, that's the bulk of their body armor. should I say, it's the bulk of their breastplate. Their arms are all heavily armored. Their legs, not so much. Their legs don't seem to be that armored. If anything, they seem quite open because you can see the flesh of their legs there. So that's definitely a weakness. They do not wear gauntlets for their hands either. They leave them unarmored. They do wear heavy helmets, and these helmets fully protect the face, and while they do have spikes sticking out of them, both vertically and to the side, these also share some similarity with the Uruk-hai helmets. They look like less refined versions, which makes sense, given I believe it's assumed that in the films that Saruman's inspiration for the Uruk-hai were creatures of orcs like this, who are highly trained and motivated to fight, as compared to orc rabble. So it's just a case of Saruman taking an idea used by the Dark Forces, and then just refining them to suit his own purposes. So their helmets look good. They've got small eye holes, which you'd hope for that. You don't want massive eye holes, in which case your eyes are quite unprotected. Now shields. They do have shields, but they're kind of similar to jousting shields, in a way being built into the armor, except instead of being built into your breastplate, these are built into the arms as part of their left gauntlets, or not, well, as part of their left arm. And it's quite interesting. They're small, but they don't really need to be large because they're so heavily armored. And these shields also double as a weapon in battle because you can use them to bash down your opponent. The swords that they wield are quite nasty looking, and ones like this definitely resemble the ancient Egyptian khopesh, which is a nice design choice. Others look like cleavers, maybe kind of like falchions, and as such they don't look anywhere near as refined or attractive as the blades wielded by the free peoples of Middle-earth, but they're not meant to. These are orcs. They might be more militarized and more orderly, but at the end of the day, they're still monsters. Some of them have handguards, like this guy, others do not. Pretty much that's the limit of it when it comes to my analysis of their arms and armor. What I will say though is on the battlefield, these soldiers will make up the bulk of your more elite infantry, or not necessarily your elite, but your upper echelon of your frontline troops. These aren't shock troops, these are meant to be the bulk of your battle line, and the upper level bulk of your battle line at that. They will do fairly well against your enemies, and if you're fighting against the Men of Dale, well, in the films these guys somehow lose to a bunch of fishermen armed with scavenged weaponry. In this mod, when they fight against the Men of Dale, if they're fighting against the lower tiered levied units of Dale, it's quite a lot more realistic in what happens, and that's a bloodbath. These soldiers can fight, and they can kill. Now, they're not as effective as the warriors of other countries and other factions, such as Gondor or Rohan in a fight, but they are still dangerous enemies nonetheless, and quite valuable as part of your battle line. So let's see what their commanding officer looks like. And here he is. And he looks like a champion of Dol Guldur. And in fact, he is a champion of Dol Guldur. Just by looking at this guy, you can get a good idea of what the champion of Dol Guldur unit looks like, comparing him to the rest of the unit. He is heavily armored, he wields a large two-handed sword, and he wears more ornate armor. And the skulls. He also has human skulls on his back. As it stands, this is all of the melee units that Dol Guldur currently has in their roster, so they're missing a lot of their lower tiered orc warriors, and these will be added in at some time, but for now this is all they can muster. Moving on to our next unit, these are the Guldur Glaives, and these are the shock infantry of the faction. And as you can see, they wear very much similar armor to the Guldur Blades, the only difference being that these warriors do not have shields, but then again they don't need shields. They're armed with large glaives. They look nasty, nasty and hooked, which would be useful in fighting against cavalry to drag them down and drag horsemen down and then hack them to pieces. But with these weapons, these guys definitely can carve a path through enemy units, especially if they're levied troops or lower ranking aligned soldiers, such as say the shipmen of Dale. And if I keep drawing comparisons with Dale, the reason why is because in the Battle of the Five Armies, that is the faction that these guys are most clearly shown fighting against. Also against the elves and the dwarves, and against those guys, they're also not really an equal match in battle, but that makes sense. They're units of the Free Peoples of Middle-earth. Do not use them in the front lines. They're also vulnerable to archers because of their lack of shields, and even though they are heavily armoured, even so, archers will still cause quite a bit of grief for such a unit. So definitely keep these guys in reserves and use them to punish your enemy when they leave gaps in their lines. So now that we've looked at the Guldur Glaives, let's see how their commanding officer for the unit stacks up compared to the rest of his soldiers. Will he look any different, or will he look the same as the other Dol Guldur unit commanding officers? No. Sorry if I can't find it. Ah, here he is. No, same as the Guldur Blades. Their commanding officer is a champion of Dol Guldur. He is heavily armoured in the same way, wields a large two-handed blade, which is shorter than the glaives, but that is still quite a dangerous weapon to have to fight against. He has the heavier helmet, and he has the human skulls on his back, which really bring the whole thing together. We'll next move on to one of the very elite units of the faction, the Champions of Dol Guldur. And these guys are very much the upgraded form of the Guldur Glaives. Now, while they don't wield glaives, instead they use large double-handed swords. I guess you could say these are kind of the equivalent of orc longswords, maybe even the Holy Roman Zweihanders used in Germany. I wouldn't necessarily jump to that assumption, but you can maybe believe that. They definitely look like they're quite good against breaking through armor, especially with their tips. They also seem to look somewhat falchion-like. Again, they're not elegant-looking weapons. They're brutal and ugly, but they're meant to be brutal and ugly. The orcs who wield them are also wearing armor similar to that worn by the line units of Dol Guldur. However, these guys wear armor that seems more custom fitted to them, which makes sense. These are meant to be the elite. They're not wearing the mass-produced rough armor of the bulk of the army. They're wearing more tailored armor. It's not perfectly tailored, because again, these are orcs. But even so, it's a step above that used by the main soldiers of the faction. They also wear iron or steel breastplates. They have iron pauldrons, or steel pauldrons. They have metal pauldrons, that's what I'm getting at. They've got gauntlets. Do they have gauntlets? No. Wait, they might have gloves, but I don't know if you'd count that as a gauntlet. Their forearms are also sheathed in steel, also good for their defense. Their legs seem to be just as undefended as... are they? No, their legs have some metal armor on it, greaves, and I believe they're called cuisses or something like that, which, yeah, that'll make them that much better defended in battle. Their helmets are more ornate than that of the line units, also very protective, even if they do have the extra spikes and edges sticking out of it. And many of them, if not all of them, carry the skulls of humans on their back. And I guess it It's kind of reminiscent of the Winged Hussars of Poland in history, in that they would have stuff on their back designed to intimidate the enemy, in this case giant braces full of feathers, but I can definitely see the terror implications of using the skulls of your enemy to scare them, and that makes sense for creatures as brutish as orcs. This unit is definitely ultra elite and should not be wasted. Much like with the Guldur Glaives, the best way to use these guys is to just smash them into the enemy line where it's weakest and let them just carve a path right through. This unit can also serve as the general unit for the faction, and as such, if you choose to make this a general unit, be very careful with it, because you don't want to send them into battle and then lose them in melee, because that could definitely cripple your plans to win a battle. Now, let's look for the commanding officer of this unit and see if they look any different to the rest of the unit. We'll pull back. Let's see. I believe this is the unit commander, and yeah, he's quite impressive looking. Also covered in steel from head to toe. His helmet looks quite a lot like a Barbute or a ancient Greek Corinthian helmet. I quite like the design. He's also got the crest above his head, which looks quite a lot like the Uruk-hai crest, which, as I've said before, is a way of bridging the similarities between both types of soldier. He definitely looks impressive, I'll say that for him. Having finished our review of the commanding officer of the champions of Dol Guldur, we'll move on to their spear units. And here's the thing about Dol Guldur's current state in the mod. They only have one spear unit, and it is quite a weak unit too. They are phantoms, yet another undead unit, complements of Sauron's dark magic. As you could probably guess by the weapons that these men wield, they are in fact spearmen. They do not appear to have faces that are recognizable, and that's something that goes for all the undead units. They do not have faces. Instead, their faces are generally covered by something. In these soldiers' cases, either helmets or helmets with band-aids underneath wrapped around them, or just cloth wrapped around their heads. Many of them wear iron breastplates that have rusted badly. Not that as dead men they'll really be caring about that. Some of them even have arrows or stab wounds in them, which is actually quite a cool touch. Some of them have pauldrons, which have also rusted. Also makes them look cool. Others have helmets too, which gives them that little bit more of armor. But again, these are dead soldiers. I don't really know how much armor they'll be needing. What I do know though is eventually in battle they do die. Much like the Wraiths, these units are not invincible in battle and can be killed or destroyed. If this is meant to be their commanding officer, he wears quite a nice helmet actually. It reminds me of the later ancient Roman helmets that were used by their legionaries. Do not ask me for the type name of their helmets, because I'm not really good with knowing specific types of helmets. It definitely reminds me of one. What with the cheek flaps and all that. He's also got chainmail around his throat. They're all armed with spears of varying lengths and varying designs. Some of them are just straight up triangle shaped, and others look a bit more... Does this one even have a head? No, some of them just don't even have heads at all and are just sharp pieces of wood with no discernible spearhead. Others have small metal bars on them to prevent people or whatever's being stabbed from being stabbed too deeply so that the blade cannot come out. All in all, they have very nice spears for undead soldiers. What faction these undead troops could have come from before they died though, that I cannot guess. Their armor looks vaguely European, which, as I said, coming from the ancient Roman helmets and the medieval look of their breastplates. I guess you could maybe at a stab say that they look like Western European warriors of the 14th to 15th centuries, or 15th century more so. In terms of where they come from in Middle-earth, that I do not know. However, if these soldiers were raised by the dark forces of Dol Guldur near Dol Guldur, I'd assume these are all undead Northmen from maybe the Kingdom of Dale in the past, or any of the northern humans who lives in the area. This guy over here has an axe in his head, and I somehow did not notice that. Okay, that is a really cool detail by the developers. I really do like that. I also did speak with the developers about this faction because I was interested in knowing why undead units were part of it, and they were the ones who relayed to me the fact that they made the choice to include undead units in this faction because of Sauron's former role as the Necromancer. So yeah, all in all, Phantoms, a cool unit. Much like the Wraiths, they're limited in number, so you cannot afford to use these as your main spear line. Also use them as supplementary forces, but in that role they can be quite useful. Leaving our spears, we now turn to our pike line, and much like the rest of its different units, Dol Guldur as of now only has one pike unit, and this is the Guldur Pikes. Although I don't know if they're actually pikemen. In terms of armor, they have similar armor to the rest of Dol Guldur's heavily armored orc warriors. They do have a commanding officer. Here he is. He stands out from the rest of the crowd. He is just as heavily armored as the rest of the champions. Same big sword, same big skulls. Same thing we saw before. These orc pikemen all lack shields, which makes sense. Pikes generally did not have shields, or if they did have shields, they had much reduced shields compared to regular melee infantry. They also have, as pikemen, they have large polearm weapons, and this is why I hesitate to say whether or not they are in fact pikes. The heads of these weapons are massive. They're definitely anti-cavalry, and yes, on the battlefield, if you use these units in that role, they will perform very well. Breaking through these with a cavalry charge is a really stupid idea. However, I don't know if these guys really are pikes, as their name suggests. They seem to be more heavily armed and armored halberd units, or at least polearm units, because pikes do not have heads that big. And if you look at these metal heads at the tip of the pikes, they're also very reminiscent of the large spears and pikes wielded by the Uruk-hai in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which again makes sense given the close connection between the two factions on a design basis way. However, their weapons, while they also do have this drop down from the shaft where a blade is sticking out, their blades are far smaller than this, which is a lot more realistic than having this giant chunk of metal at the end of a pike, because pikes are heavy when they're that damn long, so you want to have as small a weight as any at the end of it, yet a blade that's strong enough to pierce through a horse, which is why historically most pikes were quite small, whereas these are absolutely gigantic. Nevertheless, you can kind of wave that away by saying, oh, it's just part of being an orc, they're naturally strong creatures. So, okay, we'll go with that. Now, with these large blades, these things will carve through an enemy as well as stab them. They're very much reminiscent of historical glaives, and yeah, these will definitely kill cavalry or infantry. The orcs of Dol Guldur have definitely made quite the right choice in picking this weapon, especially if this is the only pike line that they can actually deploy in battle as of now. Moving away from the line infantry of Dol Guldur, we now come to the archers and ranger units of the faction, and here we have the Mirkwood Trackers, who, as their name suggests, probably live in a Mirkwood forest, hunting and killing creatures in there, and engaging in archery duels with the elves of King Thranduil and Prince Legolas. And I don't really think these guys are even a match for such esteemed enemies. As you can tell, they're light bow infantry. As orcs, they're also of small stature compared to the men of Middle-earth, be they the free peoples of Middle-earth, or be they the enslaved humans who fight for Sauron. These orcs are definitely smaller than both. They have quite an interesting design. They use recurve bows. Well, at least, yeah, it looks like a recurve bow to me. Or a compound bow. No, definitely a recurve bow. Which in real life was something that was often used by steppe peoples. And they are very powerful weapons. So, historically, these things were the tool used to destroy many civilizations from horseback. In this unit's case, they use them on foot, and being such light infantry, they should not be allowed near enemy infantry at all, nor enemy cavalry. Both will shred this unit in an instant. So yeah, make sure to keep these guys away from combat. Even in an archery duel, they'll probably get slaughtered. Definitely use them to pepper the enemy, but do not rely on these to clear the enemy army of infantry for your infantry to then slaughter them. That's not going to happen. These guys are definitely a supplement to your main battle line, rather than being the bulk of your fighting force. Looking at their armor, they don't really have armor. What they have instead looks like hoods. So they have no helmets, which, yeah, that kind of sucks for them, because that means they get hit in the head, they get killed just about instantly. They have no armor for their chest, or at least no proper armor. Instead they wear what looks like cloth and capes, over which they stick pieces of metal haphazardly, such as, for example, these square pieces of metal on their chest. These are just about useless. They remind me of the really old Roman Republican Hastati, and those were the lower class warriors of Rome who fought as infantry on the front lines. And if you look at artwork of them, sometimes they'd have metal dishes on their chest which made up the bulk of their body armor. And while that kind of makes sense for poor infantry, it makes sense because they have large shields, so they don't need much armor on their body. Whereas these guys are archers. And while yes, archers normally you wouldn't need them to be wearing heavy armor because you don't expect your archers to fight in battle, they will still get hit by enemy fire. So you want them to be able to at least absorb some firepower, and these guys do not have it at all. Even the armor positioning is sometimes really wrong on these guys. If you're going to have metal on your body, at least put the metal over your heart. This guy's left his heart open, whereas the right side of his chest is covered. Not all of them do that. Some of them have armor in the right place, but even then, it's too little too late. Now, let's look at their commanding officer to see if he's any better equipped than his men, or orc in this case. It is definitely a large unit though, that is one thing it has going for it. Because it is a orc unit, there are a lot of people in it. Which means a lot of subpar arrows and firepower will be headed at your enemy. I cannot see their commanding officer. If anyone can, I would much appreciate it. But I cannot. So I will assume he is just as well armed as the rest of his forces. Which is to say, not very much at all. We'll move on from the Mirkwood Trackers, and we'll move on to the Mirkwood Raiders. And these guys are very similar. The only real difference between these troops and the archers is that these are javelin men. They throw their spiked javelins at the enemy, and yeah, hope to God they don't get killed by the enemy in turn. Now, as javelin men, these guys naturally have shorter range, and when you're this lightly armoured, and they are just as heavily armoured as the archers, which is to say not at all, getting close to your enemy if they focus down fire on you is quite the difficult thing. However, if you are able to reach the enemy, these javelins should be able to kill enemy units somewhat effectively, especially if they're lower tiered. And that's kind of going down to the main core of the weakness of this faction, is that because it's unfinished, while they do have some strong units, their archers are absolutely crap. They are useless in battle, so relying on these guys is not the right move whatsoever. These or the archers. If you want to make this faction really viable in battle, you either have to use massive amounts of infantry, or you'll have to wait till more units are added to the roster. But apart from that little tangent, they're not very good units. They have the same hood, the same ragtag pieces of metal on their chest, but they do have something that no one else has. Little wooden shields, and that gives them a modicum of self-defense that the archers do not have. And it makes sense that because they're javelinmen, they're expected to get within closer range of the enemy, so they should at least have something to defend themselves from enemy attack. Small shields like this were very commonly used throughout history. I don't know if necessarily in a square shape. Most small shields that I've seen used by troops in this role tended to be round, but square works as well, I guess, in this case. Their javelins are spiky and probably rusted because these are orcs, so if you get hit by one of them, you have a nice case of tetanus coming through. Definitely a interesting looking unit, if not necessarily the strongest. With these guys covered, and just as I assumed, they probably do not have a general who stands out from the rest, and no, they do not. With these guys now covered, we'll move on to the final unit currently fielded by Dol Guldur, and that is their artillery. They also have onagers, and while they look quite nice and wholesome, I hope that in the future the design of these are changed so that they look evil, like the faction that they're used by. I think that'd be a nice way of showing visual differences between the factions. As it is, their crews are also lightly armed and armoured orcs, who probably only have daggers on them. They wear the same haphazard armour as the archers and skirmishers. And yeah, these guys give the faction the ability to break down walls and defences. So it is possible to break down fortifications with these. So they are definitely useful. But much like the other dark units, they lack an extensive roster of artillery, and in this faction, which already is so short on units, it's a lot worse. This cannot hope to match against the trebuchets used by Gondor, but then again, you kind of shouldn't want to get into an artillery duel with Gondor. It's not going to work. So yeah, that's about the bulk of my thoughts on this unit. Overall, looking at Dol Guldur, I actually do really like the faction, and once it's fully fleshed out, I believe it'll be absolutely amazing to see. But as of now, it's lackluster, which again makes sense, it's not finished. But because it's not finished, it has a very unique feel, I believe, that once it does get the rest of its units, it'll never really function the same way. So I guess you can kind of look at this video as a bit of a snapshot of what it would be like to play Dol Guldur now compared to the future. With what it currently has, its strength is definitely in its heavy infantry, be they shock troops or just swordmen. Spears and pikes are able to be fielded, specifically pikes. And if I were to be playing this faction, I would just about build the bulk of my army on pikemen, swordsmen, and glaivemen, and I'd kind of not really use their undead units or their skirmish units, just because when you bring them to the battlefield, they're not really going to be in any way useful in fending off enemy forces. If the enemy has brought their own archers to the battlefield, they're just kind of subpar compared to what the enemy can field for the most part. So overall, that's the current state of Dol Guldur. I very much hope to see what it looks like in the future. If you like these kinds of videos, please let me know. Please like and subscribe. And if I get positive reaction to these videos, I will continue to make more. I'm not too sure what the next faction will be, but rest assured, for the next one, I'm probably going to go with a faction that's a bit more filled out in its roster. With that said, this is Jacob signing out. Bye.